So good morning to everyone, and welcome to this exciting moment. I would underscore exciting by not necessarily referencing who we all are, although this is going to be a very exciting conference, but at this very moment, on the floor of the House of Representatives in the United States Congress, there is a major effort to try to develop a democratic response to the effort to get gun control. There are several members of Congress led by John Lewis, one of the great heroes of the civil rights movement. And of course, at this very moment, people are voting in Britain on Brexit. And one of our panelists, who we had hoped would be able to join us, who is a UK citizen, has decided that it's probably more important for him to make democracy work, if he can, in Britain than to come here to talk about it. So this is not an untimely conference, let's put it that way. I think it's very exciting. Our title, we didn't intend the title to be ironic. We intended it to be quite serious, and I think, as you will hear from many of our panelists, there are fascinating experiments that are underway in many parts of the world and in many sectors in looking at what democracy is today. But we certainly know that there is huge popular alienation and great discontent and distrust of institutions that relate to democracy. I want to thank all of you who have come from near and far. We have panelists who are coming, participants who are coming as far as from Brazil and from Australia. And we also have many others from across Europe and North America, and we will have lots of comparative perspectives in this conference. I want to thank the Open Society Foundations for co-sponsoring this conference with us, supporting this particular conference, and finally, not least, Sonia Topavsevich for her organizing work on the conference. So those are some of the background pieces of information. I wanted to say a few words about the context in which we are having this conference, not just the day that I described to you today, what's happening in Britain and the United States. This is really the final event this year of a far-reaching initiative that we organized and set out to engage in on the frontiers of democracy here in Budapest. And we used that term fairly intentionally, partly referring to geography and partly referring to a famous speech that had been delivered in July of 2014 by Prime Minister Viktor Orban, in which he famously declared that he was an illiberal Democrat and that he was not interested in pursuing the basic elements of liberal democracy and choosing as his models Turkey, Russia, and also China and Singapore. So, taking our geographic location, we thought this gave us a great opportunity to explore what is going on with democracy today. And we've had a series of very exciting events, 5 major international conferences, of which this is the final one, and a whole series of lectures and workshops and seminars. The other conferences that we've had, and I will show you a film clip, very brief film clip in a moment, that sort of captures the essence of these earlier conferences, just 5 minutes. The first one was on the crisis in Western constitutional democracy, and we did that together with the Stanford University Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. The second one was on the protection of minorities in a democracy, looking comparatively at the civil rights movement in the United States and the Roma rights movement in Europe. The third conference, which we just had in February, was on the meaning of illiberal governance. Quite a fascinating exploration with participants from Russia and across Central and Eastern Europe as well. And then, of course, today we are looking at experiments and innovations in democracy, trying to be both innovative and optimistic So I would say that CEU is very well positioned, not only geographically, but perhaps intellectually and politically, to explore the frontiers of democracy. This is our 25th anniversary. We are celebrating that this very week. Founded in 1991, which was at a time of enormous optimism about the power of democracy to overcome the legacy of totalitarianism. And that's what the basic framework of CEU was all about, was to bring intellectual freedom and revive it in this part of the world and then beyond as well. As it turned out, I think the optimism had two fundamental flaws. The first was that the transition from totalitarianism does not necessarily lead to democracy. I think we have learned that. We've learned that the hard way, and we can see that in many ways. And the second, perhaps even more fundamental flaw, which isn't fatal, but it's fundamental, is that democracy itself is challenged from many directions, including perhaps most especially from within. And today, we are in a very different geopolitical environment from 1991 when CEU was founded. We know that what were then the forces of integration, which were really bringing countries together, creating the European Union and all of the integrated elements of Europe and beyond, are now in danger of being overwhelmed by forces of disintegration. And the disintegration, which is coming from some of the frustrations that I will mention, but also from some failures to recognize some of the bases for those frustrations, the failure perhaps to think about people's dignity and identity as the underpinnings of their own political action and their own political aspirations as democratic integration proceeded. And then we've, of course, had various institutions that have been captured by oligarchies. There's growing inequality in democratic countries. And in the response, I think what we've seen is the rise of these alternative models of illiberal governance, which have stimulated and in some cases have manufactured or certainly manipulated fears and created circumstances for neo-authoritarianism to potentially appear. So we're in a very delicate moment, I think, in this great debate over the future of democratic governance. But I think before we bury ourselves in pessimism about this subject, we should also take stock of the fact that there is a rising popular demand, which is measurable and palpable, for greater control over one's own life and one's own future, demand for participation in governance, demand, as I said earlier, for dignity and identity and equality, demand for human rights and freedoms. And you can see these demands in almost all of the major events related to democratic uprisings over the last several years. Almost all of them either suppressed or failed, but all of them hopeful and expressing the demand. Taksim Park, Euromaidan, Hong Kong, Black Lives Matter, many, many other movements for democratic change. So I think as we see the demand rising, it continues to do so even though the supply of healthy democracy may be diminishing. So that's really one of our most important themes that we've been exploring in these conferences and will certainly explore today. Let me just say that our conference most recently on illiberal governance, I think, reached some very important conclusions that are worth repeating briefly here as we look at the innovations and experiments that we'll explore today. First, we know that democracy, we don't often remember, but we know that democracy and liberalism are not the same thing. They are often conflated. Liberalism, certainly in economic terms, tends to imply the deregulation and opening of economic markets, and it is the prime mover of globalization, of course. I think it also is symbolized by the collapse of the Keynesian consensus that occurred after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which meant that there was basically no underlying consensus about the role of government and the role of the public sector in engaging in economic activity or in supporting economic activity. And this led to the rise of the global economic elites and growing inequality, the reaction against globalization, and the roots of the neo-nationalism and illiberal governance that we see. So that was one of the big conclusions of our last conference. The second big conclusion was that democratic elections can be the entry point for illiberal governance. That in fact, democracy and illiberal governance are not necessarily at odds. That through the capture of an election and a supermajority, an executive can control the legislative branch and force through major changes which will change the very institutions of democracy in the country. And that too we have seen in a number of instances. The third big conclusion was that unfortunately liberals, among whom I would consider myself one, although not necessarily in the term that we were using earlier about liberalism as distinct from democracy, but liberals often downplay to their detriment the key illiberal issues that need to be addressed, issues of security, issues of sovereignty, issues of identity. We don't tend to spend as much time thinking about those as perhaps we do or should. And those, indeed, are the issues that are picked up by those who are pursuing an illiberal and sometimes authoritarian, or certainly in many cases demagogic, approach toward democracy. And then the fourth conclusion of the conference was that it's especially relevant, and especially relevant for our discussions today, which is that illiberal governance may not be sustainable. That in the long run, there are limited tools for dealing with mass discontent of the kind that I was talking about by an illiberal government in a digitized world, that old hierarchical models are being disrupted, and that democratic innovators can take advantage of these disruptions, and that's what we will be looking at today. So what comes next? Are there ways to make democracy work? That's really what we're here to explore. From inside and outside kinds of experiments in democratic development. So we will have 4 panels, and we will pursue 4 broad topics: innovations in civil society, experiments with political parties and elections, new ideas for digital communities, and then finally a concluding panel which will look at all of these issues and beyond conventional democracy and see what we might learn. So I want to just very briefly introduce the chairs of the 3 panels, and they in turn, when they take their places up here, will introduce their panelists. And of course there's plenty of material about our panelists in the program. Donatella Della Porta is the first panelist chair, and she is the Dean of the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. Tom Carruthers is the Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., and Ethan Zuckerman is the Director of the Center for Civic Media at MIT and a Principal Research Scientist at the MIT Media Lab in Cambridge, Mass. And we're very fortunate to have all of them and all of the other leaders, many of whom are could easily be introduced by me at this moment, but I think that would take too much of our time. So before asking the first panel to come forward, let's look at a very short 5-minute clip of the conferences I've been describing to you, so you get a sense of the context in which we're operating. Thank you.
Globally, there is to democracy, and it's very appropriate that we think about that and what the right responses are.
The existence of captive voters is an important finding, and it's an important finding that complements the comparative literature that has only looked at vote buying and gifts.
The challenges we face to democracy today are nothing on the order of what democracy confronted during the Great Depression.
If you have a political and economic system which has entrenched the allure of corruption, that has lowered the price of corruption, and that has increased the impact of corrupt rents on the political game, this in the long term is going to make democracy, real democracy, very hard.
That in so many of these processes that we're discussing, culture actually matters.
One of the important things that we need to pay attention to is the rise in anti-terror measures and the curtailment of a number of fundamental freedoms in the name of national or international security.
In a famous speech 2 years ago, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán famously declared himself to be a champion of illiberal democracy without further definition, but he did cite as his model the governments of Russia, China, and Turkey, and Singapore, I believe, as well.
The world has become too open in order basically successfully to close for a very long time. But on the other side, the elite should understand that they cannot have the best of everything. In a certain way, what happened was the globalization, that the elites became much more mobile, and their dependence on the citizens has been very much reduced.
One side, the side which lost the Cold War, Russia and those who associated with Russia, they felt depressed, discriminated, and very bad, and they tried to compensate it with different forms. And the other side, the side which won, was triumphalistic and really believed that everything was possible. Now it's time to understand that not everything is possible for both sides.
The critical movements in the Turkish electoral scene is mobilized on the basis of nationalist sentiment, but primarily with security concerns.
The America that you see today, that many of you have unfortunately seen in awful videos in which police officers shoot and kill unarmed black teenagers, choke to death unarmed black grandfathers, punch and beat elderly women, shoot and kill adolescents playing in a park, or assault teenage girls in bikinis. That America is very real. Those videos and the transmission of those videos on social media have allowed the country to, have compelled the country to face something that they have not been willing to face solely on the word of black people.
And the universal obligations matter because they're not just for refugees, they're for all of us. The United States can't stand by and pretend this is happening on another planet, and that's what it's been doing. Some of American policies in the Middle East have contributed to the refugee flow, let's be frank.
Journalism is being threatened globally, right? And increasingly in our global world, we need to understand and have information about each other, right? We are not living in silos. So that's why I said you need a global response.
Good morning. And it is a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel. I'll introduce them, then I'll introduce the panel, and I give the speakers about 10 minutes each for the first round of presentation. So, Jan Kubik from the University College London, Laszlo Bruszt, here is presented at Central European University, Intissar Kherigi, Jasmine Foundation in Tunisia, Elena Pavan, Scuola Normale, Superiore, a colleague of mine, and Eduardo Romanos from the Complutense University of Madrid. And as John said before, we have the task of introducing some hope in a discussion about frontiers of democracy, which also see some dark side, some pessimistic evolution. And I'm glad that we can introduce this hope in the very beginning of the conference. Very often conferences about democracy start with the most pessimistic side, and then they say, but there are also some movements. Now we start from these more progressive developments, recognizing, however, that they are struggling against other trends in democracies which are not positive. So we will try to introduce some hope, but also to reflect on the conditions under which these hopes can develop. The flower can be blooming, and we will start also. I want to start, but I know that my colleagues, in many cases, also will address the issues of what do we mean by democracy. So this, we are talking about frontiers of democracy, but there is already a hint that democracy can be something different in conceptions and practices. And let's see if I can work, if I can, yeah. A first point I want to develop is that there have been always different qualities of democracies that have been stressed by different theories, but also by different actors, progressive social movements among them. Recently, authors such as Piero Zanvallon or Colin Crouch has distinguished different characteristics that have made democracy developed, and they pointed at the fact that the conditions are usually conditions that pushes towards different level of equilibrium between qualities which cannot be all optimized at the same time, but which tend to be in tensions with each other. And my first claim that I want to submit to the debate of the panel today is that progressive social movements have always introduced and pushed for and defended some democratic qualities which are sometimes in tensions with mainstream types of development. If we follow the main theorist about democracies, I think we can see two lines of tensions. One is between delegation and participation. Democracy of the modern has always been presented as a democracy of delegation, but at the same time, many authors, many politicians, many citizens have stressed the fact that delegation only works when it is checked by what Piero Zanvallon called a counter-democracy, a democracy of control from below. And social movements have very often stressed these dimensions of participation. Very often today, these dimensions of participation has been blamed for the crisis of democracies, had been called populism, but many political scientists and sociologists have said that participation is at the very core of democracies, and that if participation and calls for participations nowadays looks as populistic appeals, in some cases it is because liberal democracies have not lived up to their own promises of letting people participate, and so that there is some types of challenge on this side. Social movements, so a first claim is they stress the importance of participation. Second claim and second line of distinctions. I think there are two main approaches of democracies also when we think about what democracies should do. There is a conception of majoritarian democracies, which is more and more developed and more goes in the directions of what have been called illiberal or authoritarian democracies. And it is a conception which says in democracy the majority wins. In democracies we have to vote. And I think that it is against this type of conceptions that many social movements have stressed the importance of democracies as producing identities, interests, not just voting, but developing high-quality arenas in which good citizens can be formed. And this is an issue which in political theory has developed under the label of deliberative democracies, with main scholars like Jürgen Habermas, but also others critical of Jürgen Habermas, as all the feminist scholars like Jane Mansbridge, Nancy Fraser, and others. And what they have stressed is that if we consider democracies as just counting heads, we will always have democracies made of very selfish citizens. What we have to produce is identities which go inclusive type of identities, and for this we need the creation of arenas of participations. Arena of participations which in the past were often provided by some institutions like political parties, about which we will talk later on, but which by broad agreement are nowadays no longer able to call for trust and to call for the type of identifications that made this development of the liberal arenas possible. So my first claim is that social movements have tried to point at to develop conceptions of participatory and deliberative type of democracy. But these participatory and deliberative types of democracies have not been always the same. The labor movements in the past, the new social movement of the 70s and the 80s, the global justice movement of the beginning of the years 2000, and the movements that John mentioned a few minutes ago, the movements in Tahrir, the movements in Tunisia during the Jasmine revolutions, the movement in Gezi Park or in Madrid or in Spain more in general, they have sustained a particular visions of deliberative democracy, deliberative and participatory type of democracy. And without abusing of my role as a chair, so I have to watch the time, what I want to stress is that we can follow the development of democracy and counter-democracy, understood as Piero Zanvallon, not against democracy, but the type of controls that developed on delegation and majoritarian forms of democracy, by looking at the specific characteristics that these participatory and deliberative forms add for social movements. My impression is that already going from the forum, which was the main instrument of the global justice movement in the beginning of the years 2000, to the camps, which have become more and more widespread on the example of Tahrir, but other examples like Maidan were there earlier on already. Well, that all these attempts introduce some new challenge, but also some examples, innovations, ideas about how democracy can develop. All of them point at some qualities which I think are qualities of participatory and deliberative democracy. One is transparency. If we look at the camps, which we are going to discuss today, one of the elements of these democratic innovations promoted by progressive social movements has been the creations of spaces in the open air, spaces in places which belong to all, in places which have symbolic values, in places which have often been the main location for social movements of the past. So places in which people could participate feeling equal to each other, in which the normal citizens is considered not as in the mainstream development of democracies as something to be kept aside because he is ignorant or she is ignorant, but someone who has ideas and you can contribute to the development of new identities. So visions of a direct democracies, which is however very often checked and controlled through the development of a lot of rules which are supposed to aim at the development of good quality deliberation. So these camps are not anarchist type of camps in the sense of without rules, they're not anomic, but they are developed in such a way that citizens should have the possibilities to develop ideas towards consensus, to understand each other, to talk with each other. Argumentations is very important in this type of innovations in democracy. So the prefigurative aspects of these camps is something which I think we have to discuss. And there is a term which has developed more and more in the debate among progressive movements, is aiming at the reconstitutions of the common. So rather than seeing democracy as just a space in which the majority wins, the type of innovations that these movements present in the democratic debate is a return to something which is not the public, which is not just something separate from the private spheres, but it is a space in which citizens can participate in the reconstitutions of state institutions, welfare states, the interventions of the government, but also politics. These movements are very often called anti-political, but they are deeply political, I think, and they've been able also to empower the people to a certain extent. They aim at transforming preferences and at creating a positive type of development in democracy. I want to skip this, but going into how to consider this type of movements in the last few minutes. Why I think these innovations are important. These spaces where people have met, where people had the possibilities to discuss about their future, and to create also political and even party type of alternative, they have been learning experiences for many. So people who participated in squares, in parks, where people recognize their diversities, but discussed about possibilities to create and develop common identities were learning experience for many. And this aspect of learning through democratic practices is also something which is not new. Political parties, trade unions had served this role in the past, but which nowadays needs the development of alternative type of actors. So during protest, people actually learn because their actions is not just oriented against, but it is also very much oriented towards the creation of ideas. And I think this is an important point. When social movements of a progressive type are stigmatized as movements for the no, or as movements that just have an image of what they do not want, like anti-political movements. Very often people has the image of citizens rioting in the streets. We have written a book with some colleagues called Meeting Democracy, in which we claimed instead that what social movement activists do is mostly meetings, is mostly encounters with one's own differences and discussions. So I think that there is a dimension of learning in action. I think that movements, and this is something that we are going to discuss also today, are also occasions for the development of new cognitions, of ideas which are developed. If we take the development of democracies in our institutions, movements have put forward a lot of ideas which have been incorporated in these institutions. So movements produce knowledge. And movements are also producers of counter-expertise, of different ideas. They prefigurate this, they tend to also experiment in practices with many mistakes and many limits, but they attempt to see how democracies could look like if they reintroduced principles of participation and deliberations. Movements have gone in different directions, and very often when one talks about the role of this type of movements, the counter-argument is, but there are also other movements which are not progressive. This is true. I don't think this is related, and this is also an issue to discuss in this panel. I don't think this is related just with the populist wind that is going around in the world. I think many scholars have pointed at the specific dimensions for the development of progressive type of movements. They said some ideas, like ideas of justice, of positive freedoms and so on, have been betrayed by some of the actors that in the past had been important in supporting them. And very often these critical moments, which the economic crisis have pushed also to extreme levels of suffering by the people and so on. These have created an environment in which it is important to see which type of new actors can take over these ideas of progress and justice, which other actors have betrayed. And I think, as authors like Ken Roberts have argued about, talking about Latin America, the important point is also in this type of evolutions of the progressive politics in general. So I will stop here and let's see if there is I will follow the order of the speakers, and I will ask the speakers to present in about 10 minutes and maybe leave some time for the discussions and then go back to the panel. So Jan,
okay,
please.
Thank you. I don't know if Should I do that or? Okay. Okay, so let me start waiting for the slide. I just have 2 slides. Well, thank you, everybody, the Rector, the colleagues. This is a wonderful occasion. I'm afraid I will be a bit less hopeful and optimistic since I come from Poland at the moment and from the conference on Ukraine and 3 Ukrainian revolutions. That makes you think about those issues somewhat differently. I will not talk a lot about innovations. I decided to concentrate more on the civil society and the relationship between civil society and the broader political regime, of which democracy is only one. As I said, I am very influenced by that recent conference on the Ukrainian revolutions. I will look at the democratic debate, I suppose, in a non-democratic setting, which sort of puts it in a slightly different perspective than the debate or debates within more or less democratic countries. And the key assumption I'm making is that the democracy is a complex architecture. And in this complex architecture, civil society, including such components of it as movements, protest actions and so on, are only one of several elements. And there is certain systemic quality to the way it is all set up, and much depends on the interactions between civil society actors and other actors in the system. That's my basic assumption. Civil society interacting with other domains is a picture I would like you to have in your mind. The empirical basis of this, which is squeezed to almost a silly simplification for the sake of 10 minutes, comes from a very large project that I've been working on for quite a while, and at least one of the participants of the project, Bela Greszkowicz, is here. So Bela will immediately recognize a lot of thoughts that I will share with you quickly from our many discussions. If you look at that slide, you see the same thing I see. Basically, you have 3 types of political regimes in the maximum simplification. Full authoritarianism, competitive authoritarianism, or some form of a hybrid, and liberal democracy. Although after Donatella's presentation of this first slide, I think that it would be very useful to break it into subtypes, as she had it into 4, but again, it's not for 10 minutes. By liberal, I mean liberal democracy. I mean the rule of majority constrained by constitutional regulations and other such devices that protect those who are not in the majority. So 4 dimensions that are important to discuss, I think, when we're talking about civil society. One is the constitution of the public space, which is really in the essence of liberal democracy, how it is set up, what kind of protections the actors participating in, say, demonstrations, strikes, or any form of action, collective action, what kind of protections they can expect. The second dimension is the dominant form of civil society in terms of how it is composed, in terms of various sectors. You have civil societies where you have the predominance of movements, and others NGOs. You may have strong or weak labor unions. I am discovering now a lot about voluntary fire brigades and the enormous significance of organizing that goes at this level. The third dimension is dominant forms or functions of civil society's behavior. There is clearly certain possibility of creating typologies of various civil societies and looking at them in terms of the dominant forms of action. Again, it can be more or less contentious, for example, in the first approximation. And fourth, which increasingly in our project attracts our attention, is the dominant normative or ideological orientations of actors, particularly dominant actors. So I try to squeeze into a simple table a lot of material. This is not very precise. Some of those things need quite a bit of development, I suppose, but again, for the sake of 10 minutes, if you look at the constitution of the public space, and if you look at places such as, say, Russia or Ukraine, putting aside growing divergence between the two situations, you have a situation of partial selective tolerance of civil society actors, but it is not the situation in which they can function more or less being certain that they enjoy or can count on protections of civil and political liberties. This is an obvious thought, but it has tremendous consequences for other elements of civil society activity or movement activity. If you look at the dominant forms of civil society composition and organization, what is very striking about full authoritarianism, and this is something that we know very well from the history of state socialism, is that you have this dualism of, on the one hand, state-sponsored, as it was once called, transmission belts of the party or will, or gongos on the one hand, and on the other hand, various attempts by people to create their own organizations, which by definition, by the pressure of the situation, are either clandestine or semi-clandestine. And they're fighting basically for political rights, for something very basic, very simple in a way. In competitive authoritarianism, the situation is more complex because it is less clearly defined. You never know what to expect. Arbitrariness, I think it was Philipp Schmitter who taught me those things many years ago, that the main feature of authoritarianism is arbitrariness. You just don't know. It is selectiveness. One day this is authorized and the next day it is not authorized, and so on and so on. Therefore, activists, particularly activists, need to constantly adjust their strategies and are being kept on their toes. Whereas in democracy, liberal, with some degree of protection at least, you have, in a maximum best case scenario, full range of forms of organization. The main thing they're fighting for, and I think that Donatella already mentioned that, and I believe this is the case, is very broadly understood checks and balances. Those are checks and balances organizations fighting for control over the process, so the process is done properly, but often, because of the lack of resources is a huge issue, is they're fighting for access. They're fighting to be heard, literally. If you look at the dominant forms of behavior, you have a lot of protest activity in the first two types, and increasingly in our project it shows that somehow, we are studying South Korea, Taiwan, Hungary and Poland, that as the democracy gets more consolidated, the role of protest, or even the intensity, magnitude of protest goes down, and you observe the rise of other types of organizations. Although across the world, as we all know, there is a systematic weakening of labor unions, which is a very important kind of element of the situation. So when you look at the liberal democracy, dominant functions can be divided, I don't know if I will get to my second slide even, but dominant functions can be divided into three broad categories. Accountability enforcement, number one. Number two, school of democracy, participation in those organizations allows people to develop certain skills. And number three, that the lesson comes loud and clear from, say, Charles Tilly, it is a method of direct claim making. Outside of existing institutions, because for whatever reason the people perceive the existing formal institutions as inefficient, ineffective, and so on. Those are really not the problems. I mean, this is simply my main point. Those are not the issues that people in places like Ukraine or Russia are discussing. they are discussing something way more basic, and their worries are much more fundamental, I would say. In terms of normative orientations, in the first two types, this is anti-systemic, broadly understood. In any situation like that, the differences, potential political ideological differences between left, right, religious, a-religious, this and that, are kind of pushed to the background. I studied in great detail when I worked on the Solidarity movement in Poland, which was, as you know, incredibly massive. And those ideological differences, as long as the movement was struggling against the system, were in the background. They came to the fore very quickly after the victory. And so you get in liberal democracy is a full range of normative orientations, but observing this from the point of view of Central Europe, and we already discussed it once in Florence, the perspective from Southern Europe is somehow different, but I want to put it on the table that the anti-systemic, or the challenge against the imperfections of democracy in the South is organized on the left, whereas the challenge to the imperfections of democracy in Central Europe is organized from the right. And this is the fundamental thing that is very important to keep in mind. But I am sort of centrist, I guess, by temperament, by learning. I think that after studying those things for a while, I believe with Aristotle in the virtue of modesty as the chief virtue of democracy, and observing what's happening in Poland at the moment, I am very worried about the danger of polarization. And I think this is a very central issue that we need to think about it. That there is the idea that democracy should be reinvigorated by more vigorous combative debate. I discussed it recently with Chantal Mouffe. As you know, she talks about agonistic democracy. And I asked her how far your agonism can go. And because she was asking me about Hungary and Poland, I said, should it go all the way? You were there, right? Should it go all the way to the debating endlessly the very frame itself? And I thought, I didn't know what she was going to say, but it was in public, and she said no. I think there are certain things that should not be negotiable, like basic constitutional provisions, basic political rights, and so on. So I think that I have to finish. Okay, so that's basically the main message, and as I suspected, I needed only one slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and I think it is a very important point that we have to distinguish the way in which these movements developed in following different developments in the political system. And the next speaker is also coming from the same side geographically. Do you share Jan's pessimism, or can you?
After he said that he is Polish, therefore pessimist, I cannot say anything. So, Hungarians and Poles are always competing with each other, who is more pessimistic. It's a comparative disadvantage, or I don't know what is the name for that. But anyway, you won today. I want to talk about another aspect of the civil society innovations, the use of civil society organizations by international organizations to promote democratization or marketization or making markets or democracies work. And that's a big industry. And there's a huge literature on that. And I cannot, of course, in the remaining 9 minutes do justice to this issue. So I will use just one case, and I would like to make one point that these experiments, most of them fail. There's a big literature on, very pessimistic literature on how these external support programs create very perverse effects, increasing helplessness, increasing or corrupting civil society organizations, having very big number of moral hazards. So I don't enter into that. what I would like to stress is one point, that what these programs can at the best do is create public spaces, nurture or create agents that can do what these agents have to do, destabilize a situation, try to induce change. And they only work if there is at least some shielding of this from outside. So there is at least these programs provide some opportunities for these organizations or actors, agents to defend themselves. Okay. Now I use a case which is very far away from the revolutions or democratic movements that were mentioned. I use the territorial development programs of the European Union, which of course is anything but sounds revolutionary, although it had some ideas on that. So the 1988 reform of structural funds basically wanted to replace a very hierarchical developmental strategy in which central governments were supposed to find out what to do for development in many diverse places. And it was the critique of these programs was that central governments neither have the idea, the information, what to do in so many diverse different local spaces, but also they don't have the incentives to do that, because once they have some resources, they would like to use that for nurturing the political clientele or strengthening the political basis, but not for finding out what to do in the most underdeveloped places. So the idea was of the 88 reforms to create some democratic destabilization, that is to create agency, local developmental agency in many diverse places, nurture political actors and agents who might do that. And part of that was promoting civil society organizations and their participation in different kinds of developmental programs. So what I talk about is the experience in the new member states and in Eastern and Central Europe. That was basically the single largest external intervention in civil society organizations after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So basically from mid-90s on till the accession of these countries, 2004 in Central Europe and 2007 in Bulgaria and Romania, the EU invented assistance programs in all these countries that tried to create de novo political spaces for this kind of developmental programs. It's important to stress that territorial development as a policy field did not exist in any of these countries before 95. Actors for that never were created. Actors, for example, regional or local level developmental associations, civil society organizations, or chambers or unions at regional level, that this kind of things did not exist. And the EU strategies basically tried basically from nowhere, nothing, create spaces and actors and agents to do what to basically correct and improve the activities of central governments to do development in local spaces. Three aspects of these EU strategies I would like to mention. The one was that I already mentioned, is to nurture agents that can politicize issues of local development. That is, it basically created forums at the local, national, and also at the European level, the EU, where civil society organizations and the alliances with business associations, municipalities, or other kind of non-state actors could challenge the programs of the government. It created sort of a mechanism that is close to what we think of pincer That is, it created very simple principles and developmental goals that the governments had to meet, and then local actors could challenge the programs of government. That this is missing this, or this is missing that. Doesn't take into account the considerations of environment, gender issues, and whatever. And so that was one thing, creating political opportunities, forums where actors could challenge it. The other was to provide not just resources, but provide incentives them to identify resources that other actors couldn't find. So those of you who know this bureaucratic field might have heard about the principle of additionality, which meant that actors could get access to resources on the condition that they could also just enough. Thanks. They themselves can mobilize resources. And the third principle was associativity. That is, they had to combine to get access to the monies. I can talk about that. Okay. And that was a 10 years, nearly a decade-long program in a pre-accession period. Okay, we looked at, with an organizational survey in 3 countries, Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, what these organizations that have participated in these pre-accession programs did after the accession. So the good news was that organizations that participated in these sustained external interventions were really doing what they were supposed to do. So they were more likely to participate in different forums and use these opportunities that the EU created. Lots of them actually created representation in Brussels. Something that was unthinkable before came about, regionalism without regions. That is, in places there were only administrative regions, actors combined and created representation in Brussels to contest the programs of the own government. Actually, the Polish, they were the first to create such an institution, and then Western Hungary was the second. And the third is that they were much more likely to mobilize resources and participate in very innovative programs. So these are the good news. The bad news is that the effects are marginal on development. That is, basically, the EU as a polity is organized on intergovernmental basis, at least in this policy field, definitely, and the national governments don't want to give up their control over the resources and don't want to share the resources with them. So from Mr. Orban to Mr. Kaczynski and for all the other leaders defend their sovereignty, meaning they exclusive control over these resources and try to marginalize these forces, and they are very successful. The EU has very limited powers and very limited legitimacy to make a solid defense to this forum. So they are active, they are visible, but their role in development is marginal. And actually, John mentioned the Brexit today. One of the outcomes of the one of the effects of the Brexit might be to strengthen. Sorry, if Cameron wins, and basically with him wins this idea that there is no need for political deepening, political integration, no need for creating a authority in Brussels that has stronger legitimacy and with that, of course, stronger capacity to control the developmental policies of national governments, then this is what is going to stay. That situation will be conserved in which what you call illiberal governments will keep their control over the resources and can marginalize these civil society initiatives. Thanks.
Thank you, Laszlo. I would like to retain a few points to continue the debate. One is a point which was also to a certain extent within Jan's presentation, and it is how long does it take to build a democracy, in the sense also that for many of the old democracies we know that it needs a long and complex process of decades or centuries, while very often we have expected the development of democracies in a fiat in the new wave of democratization. And I think that this is an aspect which should be put on again on the floor, which type of institutions developed at which speed in the different cases. Other questions is what is the role of social rights in it, because Laszlo has introduced a dimension of political economy. Democracy, as liberal democracies, has always been considered as mainly concerned with civic and political rights, but what we know is that social rights have been also extremely important in legitimizing democracy, and also in legitimizing democracies against other type of formats. And nowadays, the type of interventions on the market is very different from the ones which characterized previous waves of interventions in democratization processes. And the third point is what is the role of the external actors in it. And Intissar will also talk from a perspective which is a perspective of, I think, the only countries which has been considered as somehow successful after the Arab Spring, but also of situations in which disintegrative type of aspects are still very much present in this type of development. So I'll give you the floor to discuss these issues.
So, good morning, everybody. I'm hoping to insert or inject some optimism here, because it's very pessimistic so far, but measured optimism, I think. For those who follow Tunisia, it has fallen down slightly in the ranking of priorities, I think, compared to what's going on in the wider region. But I think that very interestingly, we see in Tunisia elements of the same type of political disenchantment that we might find in more advanced democracies. But at the same time, we see also new social movements and new actors who are trying to push the frontiers of democracy and trying to create new public spaces that overcome the established clientelistic relations that you have between the state and society. So just to inject that optimism, to remember those moments of euphoria, I think is helpful. And Tunisia, I mean, I think the narrative on Tunisia in the global media was a bit simplistic. I think the issue of social rights is very important here, and that's something that we see coming up now in Tunisia when it comes to the capacity of a representative democratic system to deliver economic changes, economic reforms, and social rights. And I think that the sort of strong antagonism that we had to dominant power that was enacted through the revolution is still very much alive through social movements that are still very active and expanding in the country. And also through the issue, the debates that we're having about economic reforms. And I think that there was a big focus in the international media more on the political rights that were being claimed during the Tunisian revolution. But there was also a big story of economic governance, the fact that the economic model that had been adopted by Tunisia and by many countries in the region had actually failed to deliver. And so, in fact, if you look at people's concerns who participated in the revolution, the number one concern was economy and job opportunities, and the second concern was corruption, and the third concern was political rights. And so it really shows obviously the three issues are not distinct. There is obviously intersection between the form of political governance and economic governance, but I think it also shows that the issue of social rights is right at the heart of why people want a political change and why they see the limitations of representative democracy, why we see that already happening in Tunisia. In only year 5 of democracy, we already feel that, in fact, representative democracy has reached its limits. I mean, really, for those, maybe just to provide some context on the situation in Tunisia after the revolution, the movements of social contestation have not stopped after the revolution. In fact, there have been tens of thousands of protests and strikes and a reappropriation of public space that Dontel talked about in terms of really firstly, an anti-state, anti-central state sentiment that was strongly expressed through the dégage movement of retaking back public institutions, public buildings, public space, and also the forcible eviction of officials who were seen not to represent the people. So there was a big crisis of state legitimacy, which has not been resolved in a way, has not been resolved through the mechanisms of representative democracy. And I think this is the issue that we find here in Tunisia today, is that, and this is something probably that scholars on democratic transition can enlighten us more on, but is how do you create a sort of political consensus which is strong enough to be able to maintain stability in the aftermath of revolution, but at the same time, how does that political consensus still allow a space for genuine reform of the political and economic system? And I think that's the main question that we're finding today, is that the national dialogue that delivered the Nobel Peace Prize for Tunisia, and which has been widely celebrated, is based on the creation of a consensus between political actors. And that consensus requires us to leave aside our particular interests and to come together around certain common values and institutions, but at the same time it sidesteps conflict. And it has somehow squeezed out the space to be able to discuss and to contest economic structures and political structures. And I think that's something that we're experiencing in Tunisia today. And that's why I think that actually the situation across the Mediterranean and here is not perhaps so different as we might think. I think there is already a crisis among the public of political disenchantment, a deep frustration at the political elite, particularly among young people who are completely disengaged, who don't find these arenas of participation in political parties, in trade unions, in more traditional institutions of political engagement, and who are already, in fact, disengaging from the political process and developing an anti-elite feeling, which is quite similar to some of the discourse that you might find here in Europe. The feeling that politicians, in fact, do not, in the end, possess decision-making power, that they are unable to make the structural changes and respond to the popular demands of the public, and that, in fact, there is a higher power, perhaps, whether it's global markets or whether it's entrenched interests that are actually more powerful than elected and representative institutions. And so we find, interestingly, many of the same debates that you would find here in Europe as well. And I think that's also, I mean, you can't see it here, but one of the issues also is the dominance of the administration and the strong state, or what some people would call the deep state, in many parts of the Arab world, which is that you have a kind of an enduring idea that the state administration is more able, so enlightened administrators are more able to realize the interests of the public than elected representatives. So you have a discourse of technocracy, of competence, of expertise, which the administration and bureaucrats possess, and experts, whether those experts are coming from abroad or from inside Tunisia. And at the same time, an undermining of the competence, legitimacy of elected political actors who represent the society, who represent the public, to be able to make those kinds of decisions. And interestingly, we have also this kind of debate that you can also see in some parts of Europe, that in moments of crisis we tend to go towards technocracy and technocrats. That is one of the main challenges. And here I wanted to just bring us back to the social rights issue, that the revolution was not just focused on cities. In fact, the revolution was also a politicization of space, of territory, and so we have to also differentiate when we talk about different regions, the fates of cities which are tied into the global economy, and the fates of interior regions and rural areas which have been left behind by this neoliberal economic model, which was contested during the revolution. So we see in the map there, you see that the dark red areas are the industrial areas, those areas where the industry is concentrated, mainly on the coast. And you can see the interior regions have very little investment in terms of industry and infrastructure. And in fact, about 80% of the public infrastructure budget is spent on coastal areas. So I think that's important to come back to that, the issue of social rights. In terms of civil society and the role of civil society after the revolution, so I think this is a bright spot in many ways in terms of the opening up of a new space for contestation, a new space where citizens can experience and practice their citizenship, to be able to construct themselves as political actors, to be able to learn, coming back to the issue of learning, many of the skills that are needed to act collectively. And what we saw in civil society was similar to what you were mentioning earlier, is a shift from being anti-systemic, which is what it was under authoritarianism mainly, to being very much demanding participation and demanding space within the political system. And we've seen that emerge in a number of ways, and I'd like here to bring back the optimism, is that we have seen a lot of citizen-led initiatives, where citizens are taking the initiative to carve out the space for themselves, which they feel that the political elite is not providing. And many of these initiatives are taken by young people who are outsiders, who see themselves as outsiders to the system, because they are never going to have a job, never going to have an elected position, never going to be part of sort of the economic and power structures. And so, for example, we have NGOs that are inside the assembly monitoring the work of the parliamentary assembly. So we have, for example, an NGO called Al Bawsala, which is youth-led. It's run by young people all under the age of 35. And their role actually is not to leave Parliament to hold itself to account or to report on its own work and workings, but actually to be inside the Parliament, to claim the Parliament as a space also for the public, where the public can come in and observe and hold political actors to account. And so it's sort of playing the role of this counter-democracy and redefining the issue of political authority and political responsibility, that yes, political actors have authority, but they also have, that is linked to a responsibility to account to the public. And so they are enforcing this idea of access for the public and of elected institutions as public spaces. And in fact, they have been able to shape public debate to create a new bridge, a new link between elected institutions and the public, and being able to raise many issues such as, for example, the attendance of parliamentarians, the issue of remuneration of parliamentarians, issues of corruption, etc. So I think that's quite an interesting instance of trying to open up political institutions and not to rely on political institutions to account for themselves, as we have, for example, in Europe. You have most reporting on parliaments is actually done by the parliament themselves, whether it's a television or it's a bulletin or whatever, but actually for citizens to go in and have an independent form of observation and participation. And so they have, if you see, they have a very active social media presence, again, trying to use different methods that reach the public and reach young people. So they have 180,000 followers. And they follow literally, I mean, they're a group of young people who sit there, you know, as long as the parliament is there. If the parliament is there until midnight, they're there until midnight. You know, they have become friends with all the parliamentarians. So there is also an issue of building expertise and knowledge, actually, and coming to be relied on by many MPs, members of parliament, as sources of knowledge and information, because they have continuity between different parliaments. And so they become a repository of knowledge themselves and have become recognized. And so it's also shifting the view that political actors have of the role of civil society as also being potentially a source of knowledge, useful knowledge for political actors. And I'll move on quickly to another issue that we talked about, which is argumentation. I think that's something very important, particularly in post-authoritarian regimes. where the citizen has not been able to practice their right to political engagement, has not been able to access decision making or even basic information about the workings of the state, about public policies. In fact, where the issue of public policies has yet to be defined. What is a public policy? How is policy made? All of these things are yet to be unpacked in a new democratic system. And so the NGO that I work with, and here's a little plug, Jasmine Foundation, we actually work on this issue of argumentation, is basically how do you construct public space, not just as a physical space, which is anti-systemic and which is where it can be a site for confrontation between citizens and the state, but also a space of debate and argumentation among citizens themselves. And how also to structure conflict and differences of opinion in a way which can also be constructive, and to accept also, maybe going with this model of agonistic politics, that consensus is not possible. I mean, ultimately, human problems, we cannot find solutions that please everybody. And how to actually be able to structure that through an effort of constant discussion and argumentation, how to understand actually what is at the heart of our political system, what is political decision making, and what is the role of the citizen in that process, and also to create this or to reinforce the constitutional principles that we have of political rights, of political equality of all citizens, by reinforcing the confidence of citizens themselves in their own capacity to form a judgment. And I think that's something that's quite important to have. So we have a number of programs where we train young people in what is public policy, how are policies made, where they actually present their own analyses to parliamentarians, where we invite parliamentarians also to come and face the public. So also it's a way of creating direct claim making, also links, rather than the clientelistic relations that one would have usually with elected representatives that we had from authoritarian time of authoritarian regime, which is that to have very personalistic relations with political actors based on favors, but really to create an idea that political actors have a responsibility to all citizens equally and have an obligation to account for their decisions. So I will skip through the rest, but I think that one positive point that I can conclude on is that Tunisia has managed to constitutionalize participation. So one of the articles in the Constitution, Article 139, actually protects and mandates that the state must put in place mechanisms of participatory democracy. And this is particularly so at the local level, to enable participation by citizens and civil society, not only in the preparation of programs, so that means not just deciding on budgets and deciding on development programs, etc., but also in actually monitoring the implementation of programs. So that means, for example, sitting on committees that actually audit or supervise the implementation of projects, and really trying to open up the decision-making process to the public. Now, obviously, this is on paper. It remains to see actually how this will be institutionalized and how, again, the role of the public and of civil society will be in trying to expand those frontiers. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much for these examples also of counter-democracy and the empowering of these type of movements. There are some aspects which I found very important for our debate. One is, you mentioned, neoliberal economic model is also at the basis of the rebellion because it didn't perform as it had promised, and especially because while officially promoting the separations of the state and the market, in the reality it created a very corrupt system. And these aspects of corruption is widespread in all the movements which we are discussing. It is an outrage against democracies which is in crisis, democracies which is not fulfilling what it has promised to be, or or a regime anyhow, which have given up the respect of citizenship rights of different type. And this outrage against corruption, I think it is a new element which we cannot brush away by saying it is populism. No, corruption is been growing extremely fast and extremely high with the neoliberal type of reforms. And there is a lot of research on this which says that what regimes developed into is an elitist conceptions rather than a pluralist conceptions of democracy. So I think that this element of this outrage against corruption is quite common in the movements we look at, but it is also common the attempt to develop alternative, and this is something which I think is extremely important. In my own research on democratization processes, what many activists regretted is the fact that immediately after the breakdown of the regime, what was suggested as implementation of democracies was elections. And both in Eastern Europe after 1989 and in the Arab Spring, what activists which I've been interviewing for my research stress is the fact that elections is not the only form of democracies, and sometimes when they come too early or when they are given too much importance, they can stop a dialogue which is developing because they give power to some parts of those who rebelled. And you mentioned the young people which felt excluded by the development in Tunisia, like in Egypt. And I think this is an element which, reflecting on how to promote democracies, we have to keep into account. Elections are not the solutions. Elections very often were there already before the transitions to democracy. And if the corrupt system is not undermined by the empowering of the people, these elections will bring to unsatisfactory type of results and elites which are not considered to be legitimate. You also push at the fact, the importance of monitoring and innovation, and I think that Elena's presentation is also pointing at the capacity of social movements of the progressive type to promote new ideas about democracy, participation, and citizenship rights. So Elena Pavan.
Can I have them? Okay, thank you. So yes, my purpose today is to provide, let's say, an alternative entry point to think about how social movement can be driving forces for social change, for democracy, and for innovation. The basic idea is that starts from also like a self-criticism of us as scholars dealing with social movements. Like, we live today in a society that is profoundly different from what it was like even a century ago, or 50 years ago, or 70 years ago. And the reason why we live in a different society is that social movements have worked as forces for social change. And in the meantime, when we have been reflecting on how movements have been promoters of democracy, we somehow focus more on the condition under which the movements have thrived or failed. We have concentrated on the relationship between the movement and the political system. We have based evaluation of our democratic levels depending on how welcoming we were with social movement, with counter opinions. What we have forgotten in the meantime is that, so we have treated movement as the object of knowledge. What we have forgotten in the meantime is that movement produced the knowledge that drive the social change. So the idea here would be that to propose an alternative epistemologies for us to think about what social movements are. So not the object of the knowledge, but to shift the focus on the knowledge that they produce. Because the knowledge, the story that they tell, then
the practices they say they envision, that they enact every day, these are the proof that the social change is not something that we can desire only. It is something that it's doable. It's a viable practice of living. So the idea of having an alternative epistemology is the idea that we, when we think about, when we tell the story to our students or to the people that we talk with, is that we start from the content rather than from the overall system. So we tell the story of a social change, starting from the contents produced by the movement. And that we focus on the systems of knowledge and belief and priorities that movement provide to the rest of the world to illustrate a possible pathway to a new, possibly more effective democracy. So seen from the point of view of knowledge, if we start from knowledge, we can understand better what it means, for example, something that has been said before. What does it mean, critical unpacking of reform? Unpacking, thinking about reforming, is actually starting from knowledge. So if we start from knowledge, what we can actually understand is that, as I said before, we're not talking about something that it's up in the air, it's a desiderata. It's a viable social change that we're discussing, and it's a change that we're actually living every day. From the point of view of knowledge, a movement practice is not only a cultural expression or a countercultural expression. It's the expression of an alternative ontology. Ontology is what it exists. So, seen from the point of view of knowledge, movements are the change. The change is present, is not in the future. And so the approach that I would like to propose today is to think about social movement as knowledge producer, looking at an example, practically, along 5 dimensions that have been pointed out in literature. There's a very small amount of studies that have been dealing with the relationship between knowledge and social movements. One of these studies that was produced by Mayo Fuster Morel in 2009 outlined 5 practices that cross political action and the production of knowledge. And these 5 dimensions are, of course, the participative and collective method, which is the prerequisite for every social movement to be a collective effort, to be a collective expression for social change. The other 4 are like the pillars of what I call a knowledge-based approach to social innovation. The production of alternative content is the key. So you produce a different discourse that is, and the challenge here is that alternative must not be understood as the exception. Alternative means that it's just a different way, but it's a doable way. It's a way that you can go along, that you can walk. The strategic thinking for broad political processes is what Professor Bruszt was saying before. At one point, what movements say, what they propose, is relevant, is useful. And governments, although they continue to take the decision, they need the knowledge produced and the expertise produced by the movements. The third pillar is the construction of relationship and network connections. So we discuss every day about the importance of the network, but we never actually put the network as a variable in understanding how important it is to be connected. We have to make this network visible. We have to value this network, not just to use them as a metaphor. The last one is the explicit attempt to change the politics of knowledge, so that what we know is something that everybody can possess, that can become part of daily practices for everybody. And I have to try, we're trying also with a research project at the Scuola Normale Superiore to translate this approach into research practice that accompany a systematic attention for the political process, because I'm not saying that the political conditions in which social movement operate do not matter anymore. I'm just saying that they don't tell the whole story of how democracy happens. So beside the structural conditions, we must look at the contents. And I've focused mainly on this movement that I call ICT for D or G, it's ICT for gender, ICT for development, and ICT for gender empowerment. So how do we tell a different story about technology and how technology can become a means for democracy where gender relations are more balanced? The production of alternative knowledge within this movement is a key dimension. This movement is engaged in a constant production of autonomous research. Autonomous research entails monitoring institutions, monitoring practices, monitoring policies, monitoring, keeping always, at pace with what happens and developing a different understanding of what is happening. One example is this last study that was published in 2015 on internet intermediaries' liability in violence against women. How much Facebook, Twitter, or internet service providers are responsible for not for perpetrating the violence, but for creating digital environment that are welcoming to forms of violence. The second is the strategic thinking for broad political processes. So the movement has developed a piece of knowledge that it's crystallized in a declaration that is called the 15 Principles for a Feminist Internet, which have become a benchmark in discussion of gender equality in political spaces like the Internet Governance Forum or within the ICANN meeting. So in the governance of the Internet, the movement entered as a useful resource. And that has happened thanks to the construction of networks. So the main pillars of this movement are organizations that are not conventional organizations. There are networks of organization. And this network organization promote network meeting where people are invited to sit around the table and discuss and be active producing the knowledge that then is crystallized. And then this knowledge is made publicly available. And publicly available means that we don't compete one another to publish in journals and to, become more knowledgeable than others in being the point of reference. We propose the knowledge and we let people appropriate that knowledge, so to transform that into a daily practice. And with this, I think I finished my 10 minutes. I'm not saying there are not challenges entailed in the knowledge production. So something before becoming knowledge must be recognized. So there are hidden power dynamics that we're not discussing here today. For each of this point, there are billions of challenges that a movement has to face. But if we stop thinking just about what happens around the movement and look at the movement and what the movement has to say, I am strongly convinced that there's a very bright way towards democracy and social innovation ahead of us. Thank you. Thank you, Elena. And I think it is interesting the ways in which these presentations point at specific interventions of social movements and civil societies in improving democracy through radical innovations in the concept of democracy itself. So they shows that social movements are not the utopian, anti-political type of actors that are often described, but they can be also very useful in pointing at concrete ways in which democracy can be implemented. And our last speaker, Eduardo Romanos, comes from a country in which social movements which developed against austerities in 2011 and afterwards have also introduced some unexpected level of innovations in the very party system, in the very electoral system. So movements which were outraged against the way in which the party system worked, rather than giving up electoral democracies altogether, they have instead decided to take up some of the opportunities created by the protest and the distrust towards existing parties to participate in elections. John has mentioned in the introduction the Brexit today. There is another important electoral moment on Sunday with the election in Spain. And besides the results of these elections, what we see is that this movement have also created innovations in terms of new political parties. So not only Podemos and now Unidos Podemos in Spain, but also transformations of Syriza in Greece, the pirate parties in which is leading the polls in Iceland, Corbyn phenomenon in the Labour in UK, and Sanders in the United States, all indicates a capacity of these social movements and the willingness of these social movements to intervene at all levels of democracy. So I leave the floor to Eduardo to tell us something also about this.
Can I get there?
Yes, the power.
Well, I would like to start thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate in this wonderful conference, and thank you, Donatella, for chairing the session. My presentation today relates to innovations in civil society, but also to topics from the other two panels in the conference, since my research deals with practices from social movements which are making their way into political institutions. And in particular, I look at practices which have to do with the use of digital technologies. What role do technological activists play in transmitting the democratic demands of social movements? How do they intervene in the institutional implementation of democratic innovations? I'm trying to answer these questions together with my colleague Igor Sadaba by looking at recent digital democratic innovations implemented by Spanish institutions as a response to the so-called Indignados movement. The internet has multiplied the ways of influencing public opinion and policy making, and has given civil society unexpected possibilities for coordination and mobilization. Social movement scholars have been active in the analysis of the impact of new technologies on organized civil action and the social movements. But some areas have received little attention to date, such as the role played by new technologies in the institutionalization of social movements. By digital democratic innovations, we refer to new practices that are being tested by political institutions in order to promote participation and deliberation through the use of digital technologies. More specifically, we are interested in the role played by grassroots tech activists, as understood by Hint and Stefania Milan, who is with us today, in the adoption of this kind of innovations by new parties and institutions after the protest cycle in Spain. In a way, the democratic innovations that are currently making their way into Spanish institutions have been cooking for some time. They were already present in previous waves of protest, but didn't fully crystallize until the recent cycle. Democratic innovations proliferate in periods when the legitimacy of the system of government comes under question. In this regard, the quality of the democratic system wasn't such a prominent issue in previous protests, but participants in the Indignados movement have underlined the need for more and more efficient political participation and deliberation channels. Perhaps for this reason, organizational and participatory innovations proposed by the Indignados went beyond expectations and have been accepted by the institutions more easily than predicted. This testimony by an activist divides the Spanish protest cycle into three phases with regard to the idea of democracy. First, the Indignados sustained a strong critique of the Spanish democratic system. Then they started experimenting with other concepts of democracy in the streets, following the model of empowered deliberative democracy practiced by the previous anti-globalization movement. Donatella has extensively examined this model, which the Indignados updated with a relatively novel concept of organizational inclusiveness directed at potential participants and the transformation of public spaces into open, empathic arenas. More recently, a third stage began with the participation of some indignados in the emergence and development of new political parties that are now ruling some important cities and aspire to do so at the national level after the elections next Sunday. In some ways, we are now presented with a movement party within which the evolution of one form of collective action into another may be observed, with the new technologies playing a significant role in this evolution. The extensive use of digital tools, which encourage participation and deliberation in these new parties, reproduce essential values and practices of the movement, thus facilitating the identification between activists and parties. The use of these digital tools has been gone with the development of a certain technophilic frame, stressing the potential of new technologies for democratic deepening. The penetration of the internet and digital technologies has redefined many of the classical political participation models. Some of the most innovative forms of collective action result from the use of online communication tools. Beyond the actual degree of engagement that these mechanisms imply, digital media have created new repertoires and intervention models. Some of these can qualify as democratic innovations, as they have played an important role in fostering deliberation, debate, interaction, and decision-making. Specifically, the internet is particularly well-suited for experimentation with distributed, horizontal, and massive forms of interaction and communication. The web has become the ideal arena for testing deliberative democracy models. Digital networks, understood as a new form of public forum, can compensate for the shortcomings of traditional representative democracy. Some online deliberative processes, such as discussion, debate, polls, collaborative filtering of proposals, and so on, when they are blended, can become processes of radical democracy. Experts in ICTs who had taken part in the Indignados movement and who joined some of the emerging parties and city councils afterwards tried to bring with them new online participation formats and deliberative digital devices. However, we shouldn't think that the technological activists can generate democratic innovations automatically or easily. The conditions of reception and interaction between social movements and parties are relevant in this regard. The new political parties assume some of the innovations emerging from the Indignados when certain environmental conditions exist. Specifically, the opportunity for tech activists to work as external collaborators with institutions that trust in the democratic potential of political mobilization from above. We are largely referring to innovations relating to debate, deliberation, and decision-making tools. The incorporation of these devices into the operation of political parties depends on a series of variables, which are the ones in the picture. Namely, the position occupied by tech activists within the parties, the control mechanisms implemented by the parties, the duration and timing of the relationship between the tools and the parties, the willingness to extend deliberative experiments, and the corresponding frames. The participation and deliberation tools used by new parties in Spain seek a stronger involvement of the public in horizontal and democratic processes. Even if it isn't always clear that the party's supporters and the general public are using these tools extensively, they always appear prominently in the public discourse. Anyway, democratic innovations are not evenly adopted across the board. A progressive, step-by-step model can be developed. We may say that most social movements are situated at the level of informal experimentation with other models of democracy, but tech activists from the Indignados movement have been able to reach upper levels of regulation and adoption. The adoption process of democratic and digital innovations relied on the action of entrepreneurs, tech activists in this case, in order to evolve from decentralized, informal, and early experimentation to the institutionalization and consolidation of digital participation and deliberation. To conclude, I would like to call our attention to other case studies which analyze parties of recent creation with a similar outlook on new technologies in other countries. They show that the myth of digital democracy and the real effects of the use of these supposedly liberating technologies do not always go together. A good example is the Cinque Stelle movement in Italy. To what extent this is similar to the Spanish case, we cannot give a definite answer, but some tentative ideas. The intensive participation of some indignados in the construction of the digital structures sustaining democratic innovations may stand as a barrier against authoritarian tendencies in the Spanish case. These activists not only pose democratic demands of the new parties and institutions, but are also acting as a kind of safety net for democratic innovations, counteracting, hacking attempts at directing democratic processes by those who have more power within parties and institutions. We shall see who wins the battle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. I think that there is a lot on the table about the richness, but also the limits to the development of alternatives and innovations by civil society organization. And there is some time now for the discussion. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the excellent presentations. My name is András Bozoki, working here, and I'd like to give two comments or questions. One is to Professor Kubik concerning populism or confrontational politics as a good thing for revitalizing democracy. And indeed, some democracies are highly technocratic, elitist, and expert-driven, and there is a promise that repoliticization will give a new impetus for democracy. So confrontation will be good in revitalizing democracy. And this is the argument in Poland. And I agree with you that this can be very dangerous if they question the foundations of democracy. Maybe we should see the intention and the discourse of these people. So as long as they go for a more inclusive, deliberative democracy and think that other peoples are equal citizens to them, it's okay, because democracy must be renewed all the time. But I think the dominant discourse in Poland and definitely in Hungary is something to create a real homogeneous national ethnic exclusive democracy for the true Hungarians, true Poles. So I think this discourse already tells what the intention is. And unfortunately, there is here a difference between Poland and Hungary, because in Poland there is maybe a repoliticization and a vibrant civil society right now, confrontation. But in Hungary, you can see the result, which the same thing happened 5 years ago. But now it is more like the end of politics. So there is a dominant hegemonic party, and the Viktor Orbán Church, a minority of the society, and the others who are silenced, fragmented, and neutralized. So there is no public discussion on politics. So it's the end of democratic politics. Maybe it is not the end of politics in terms of Kremlinology, but you can see this direction if you take a look on Hungary. So it is, and the promise was already like Chantal Mouffe and Carl Schmitt made, that there should be revitalization and direct participatory democracy. That was the promise of Fidesz already 6 years ago. So I want to learn your reaction to this. And the other comment to our colleague from Tunisia, international political science often presents contemporary Tunisia as a success story, the only success story of the Arab Spring. So all other Arab Spring movements failed, but Tunisia ended up in a democracy. So Freedom House considers Tunisia as a liberal democracy, if I am not mistaken. So I wonder what is your reaction to this? Do you agree with this picture? Is it not somehow, is it really academically sound that Tunisia can be qualified as a democracy? If it is democracy, what sort of democracy, liberal or illiberal? And the footnote to this point, and maybe to the last lecture as well, that after the great hopes, there is some disappointment with social media in those countries when democracy is on the decline. So, for instance, in Hungary, people think that Facebook and other agora of social movement, it is just an illusion. They do not help anything in social movements. Quite the contrary, they create some separated bubbles when people enjoy themselves and basically they do not enter to a broader public discourse just to exchange their ideas with their own friends. So instead of inclusion, it creates separate bubbles in the society. It doesn't help democracy at all. So these are my questions or comments. I want to learn your opinion.
Okay, thank you very much. Working? Okay. My name is Gábor Bolyár. Maybe I misunderstood, but did I understood correctly that you say that the reason of the general dissatisfaction in the liberal democracy is the increasing corruption? If this is what you said, one of the reasons, I agree with it. But my question is that, at least in Hungary, I see that in the so-called illiberal democracy, or in authoritarian systems, the corruption is even higher, and the people do not see the corruption is institutionalized. And I haven't heard any comment on that as an answer for the dissatisfaction.
Yes, I'm Philippe Schmetter. I caught a phrase from Donatella, the limitations. I didn't hear enough about the limitations. As is often the case, there is a massive selective bias when people discuss civil society. They're only the good guys. There are lots of bad people out there in civil society, and very undemocratic. And many, incidentally, social movements are not themselves necessarily internally democratic. That seems to me to be another one of those. So if you select out those particular good guys where there is some kind of deliberation, etc., you're presenting a very selective picture of civil society. So the Eduardo let slip the Cinque Stelle movement in Italy, for example, makes very extensive use of digital technology. So address this question of the selection bias in the analysis of civil society and its relationship to digital technology.
Actually, my question is closely related to this. First, thanks for the inspiring presentations. I'm Virag Monar from the New School for Social Research. So I think Donatella opened the panel by stressing the importance of definitions, right? And then you discussed different conceptions of democracy. In the introductory remarks, John Shattuck talked about different definitions of liberalism and illiberalism. But I had the impression that none of the speakers actually felt the need to define what civil society is, right? So I'm kind of wondering if you could reflect on that, what is, maybe we also need a sharpening, a theoretical and empirical sharpening of what civil society is. Maybe conceptions of civil society are changing as well. And along the same lines, so I was wondering, so what is civil society? Non-governmental organizations, more diffuse social movements? Is it an arena of participation, a site of political deliberation? What about uncivil society? Right, so is the National Rifle Association in the U.S. a civil society organization? And then how do we make the distinction between civil and uncivil organizations? What about the role of the use of violence and so on? So I was just wondering if you could all reflect on, then what are the conceptual boundaries of civil society?
Yeah, thank you very much. Bela Grešković, Central European University, a little bit along the same lines, but two specific questions. Can it not be the case that after long decades of liberal hegemony in economy and in politics, actually the rising movements of the popular right should be seen as emancipatory? Emancipating themselves. They want their symbols back, their holidays back, their songs back. They want to be taken as equal. Two, when we think about what we see really, the rise of right-wing movements and other kind of political actors, do we expect them to be innovative in the sense that you discussed here, for instance, Elena, do they produce valuable knowledge for democratic purposes, or should we think about them as purely imitative?
Imre Szabó, Political Science Department here at CU. And I would like to have a question of why is the workplace missing from this analysis as a possible space for political action and civil society? I mean, you mentioned the decline of trade unions, but this is taken as an assumption, and still the workplace is the place where people spend most of their time in communities, or at least in groups. And for some reason, this is completely missing from the new social movements, that the workplace could be a space where people could be and should be mobilized. Why do you think this is?
Yes, go ahead and then...
Okay. Hi, I'm Felipe Santos, also from CU. I wanted to ask Eduardo about a couple of points that he was raising. The one of the participation of social movements in institutions through these kind of new parties or new candidatures, and also the participation through internet, right, that you were highlighting. Because traditionally, social movement scholars would say that these two issues, right, one, we could call cooptation by democratic institutions, and this participation online would lead to also the demobilization of different kinds of movements. And also we are seeing in Spain that this is happening in the streets, that we have many less protests since the appearance of Podemos. And I wanted to ask you whether you think that this kind of cooptation and online participation that we're seeing in Spain is anyhow different from what we've seen before. And if you think so, how is this different? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Peter Molnar, and I'm here at CU, and I was one of the founders and leaders of Fidesz and a member of parliament in the 90s, and I have been active in many civil society efforts, and I was talking to a young co-activist friend, and who's told me, for us, you know, Peter, for us it's not an option to participate in these illegitimate corrupt institutions. And I told him, it's very dangerous not to participate. And he said, I think it's very dangerous to participate. And he didn't say that because he's not brave. He's very brave. But he thought in a strategic way, it's not good. And I would like to ask you, how do you strike the balance? Because I myself see it as a great danger that people frame civil society, as it was mentioned in a different aspect, as that's the positive thing. If you do that, you are cool. If you are going into institutional politics through elections, you are entering a rotten world. And I understand the point that was also made on the panel that in a way, like, First, we need to create an enabling social fabric. Otherwise, the institutional part through elections may not work and just kind of further set in stone the bad system. But at the same time, if we don't participate in that, then those people who are just doing politics in a cynical, corrupt way will create the laws on education like it's happening in Hungary, and then parents can think about how to escape with their children to save them for the screwed up educational system, because laws are still made in parliaments which are elected through elections, and no one can suggest any realistic alternative how to create legitimate formal representation to make such decisions like how schools are working. So I think it's crucial to participate in elections, and I think it's really dangerous if anyone discourages anybody to do that. And how do you strike that balance between the two dangers? I'm really curious to hear your response. Thank you.
And we have about 15 minutes now. I was told that since we started a little bit later, we can go until 10 to 1. So I will give the floor to the panelists. Just wanted to clarify one point about also Philippe's questions. It is true there is a lot of different groups in the civil society, but we were called to address the issues, I read from the program, of how civil society actors operate to promote democracy. So the point which we wanted to develop was about the progressive type of civil society. We are not pretending that they represent them all, but it is in 2 hours and something you cannot address all civil societies. And what I find it correct that we have to devote attention also to the other side, but we cannot all the time that we talk about the progressive side of civil society also address the other side. We don't have the time for. And it would be like when you talk about left-wing parties to be reminded that there are also right-wing parties. It is true, but it is something we are not addressing at the moment. So our operational engagement was to talk about the progressive side of civil society. And when I pointed at the limitations, what I was meaning was more the fact that civil society, also of the progressive type, alone cannot very often develop on all the innovative potentials that it is presented. But clarify this, let me give the floor to the panelists in the same order as in the beginning. So if Jan wants to start addressing questions in 3 minutes.
Well, thank you. This is what one can dream about in a way. This session and particularly the series of questions, I think, took us exactly to several central concerns, and I guess we could spend the whole year debating all of this, so let's try to do it in 3 minutes. I would take it in the reverse order, and I will not cover everything perhaps, but the remarks about disengagement and engagement and the participation and non-participation and relative merits and demerits of both. It is absolutely scary that you describe this for Hungary, and the last few months I have exactly the same conversations, exactly the same lines of reasonings, the same dilemmas expressed in Poland. Exactly the same thing. Like young people saying, you know, exactly in the words you used. If I get engaged, I get into this kind of dirty business. If I do not get engaged, then they you know, sometimes it is the same thing with many people, young people saying, educated in Britain, they say, I am for Brexit, and you ask them why, and they say, just for the heck of it. I'm tired of the existing status quo of corrupt politicians who are constantly lying. They can never answer a question in a straightforward way. Let's mess things up, let's stir things up, and let's see what comes out at the end. And this sentiment is across the world. I'm, my one leg, or yes, a lot of parts of my body, I guess, still brain, heart in the United States, and you watch what's happening with Trump, and you have this massive mobilization on the right, and that takes me to the question of the selection bias and the right part of civil society that Philip mentioned, and the lady who followed. My definition of civil society is neutral. It is taken, I wrote about it in a few places, but basically it is any form of organization that exists between the kinship and the state. I am influenced by Ernest Gellner's very, for me, formative book on civil society and its rivals. So in sociological language, any secondary group, any organization. That's why in our project, the fourth dimension of analysis is normative or ideological orientation, because then we are trying to look at where they are, more in the center, liberal, more left, more right, and how they organize, and whether, what role they play in the system. It is very important to know, and I guess we know it. You listen to the people on the right, you ask them, what are you fighting for? They say, we're fighting for democracy. They feel excluded. They feel that they are progressive. Kaczynski is using the word. He says, I am progressive. I'm fighting for including more people in the democracy that so far was hijacked by liberal elites, or something like that. So for us, it is neutral, and for me to understand this dynamic of the left, right, the ones we like and the ones we do not like, is extremely important. What is really at the bottom of all of this, going back to András's question, which again, what you say, and I can just nod, because we see and experience the same things now. The only answer I have, and this is part of the panel, what we discuss in the panel, is knowledge. It must be a relentless effort on the part of everybody, from educational institutions, parents, to movements, civil society organizations, to teach people about basics of democracy and what I call democratic architecture. To teach them about liberal democracy, teach them about the significance of the rule of law, teach them about the significance of protections of basic rights, teach them about, of course, social rights also, teach them about the constitutions. There's research now coming out of Poland. People do not, 40-50% of the people do not understand why the COD, the movement against the current government and its actions, is talking about constitution. They do not connect the significance of the constitution with the protection of their own rights. A final thing about corruption. I am not sure that there is such a clear link between neoliberalism and corruption. If you look at post-communist countries, countries that instituted most far-reaching neoliberal reforms, to put it bluntly, are least corrupt. And that is I think the third variable, which is the quality of democracy, or the type of the political system. If you have neoliberalism with relatively working democratic barriers, in the most general sense, it works better than when you don't have those barriers, because then the corruption becomes rampant. So it is more than the game between neoliberalism and corruption. The type of political regime, again, is a very important variable.
Thank you.
I will not be able to, in 3 minutes, to provide a new definition for civil society, but I think that from the perspective of this panel, the most important thing is that came up in several different ways, is that what civil society organizations can do is this democratic destabilization, that is to challenge the status quo and create what I think Philip's favorite Albert Hirschman would say, disequilibrium, create chances for disequilibrium learning. They not necessarily solve problems. They politicize problems. They create destabilize a bad status quo, and that's also answer to Béla's question. Of course, lots of these movements are on the bad side from my perspective, but they challenge a very bad status quo that is built on the very strange marrying of neoliberalism and corruption. I think I'm a little disagreement with what Jan said. The neoliberalism is a very funny, has a very funny politics. It says that the more you would like to serve the interests of public, the more you should depoliticize, technocratize economy. It's a very counterintuitive. It's very much against the last 300 years of political science, and so it means that politics has to come back in one way or another, and it comes back. It comes back sometimes with vengeance and in very bad forms, but it has to come back. And the other thing is that if you depoliticize economic change while a massive redistribution of wealth and opportunities happens, like in neoliberal reforms, that means that this can create a very dramatic redistribution of economic power and power to get under control politics. So this is in Central and Eastern Europe, contrary to Russia or former Soviet Ukraine. The reason why not oligarchs took over was that they were much more gradual and they couldn't really exclude politics, democratic control over these processes. So the Polish success is not because Balcerowicz introduced very rapidly, I don't know what kind of sweeping reforms, but because Balcerowicz was ousted very fast and democratic control over privatization was taken over. So I think that makes a difference. And when I heard about the situation in Tunisia, I got really cold feet because this remembers me of what happened in Ukraine. That if there is such a strong pressure to go ahead with technocratic reforms, that will have backlash. The only, actually I learned also from Philip's study of Spain, that the only way to stabilize and consolidate democracy, that was a success, the key of success in Spain, for example, was to make a socio-economic pact, politicize, not depoliticize, exactly the opposite, to politicize the economic change, and get control over politics. So that's what I see. That's why I see very positive the role of civil society organizations, that they try to repoliticize these issues.
Thank you, Laszlo. Intissar.
Okay. Right. So again, in 3 minutes as well, I think I'll be able to define democracy, liberal democracy, liberal democracy. I mean, I think there are obviously different definitions of when democratic transitions finish. There's the line that when democracy is the only game in town. I think Alfred Stepan says that, or that when democracy is the only rule, basically, the only game that political actors know they're constrained playing, then you are a democracy. I don't know. Tunisia, in terms of the actual legal framework, constitutional framework, Tunisia is a liberal democracy. If you look on paper. You have, a constitution which protects civil and political rights, which protects rights of minorities, which protects a range of social and economic rights, environmental rights even. But the issue is, institutionally, those structures that were there before the revolution are still there. Institutions are very difficult to change. They have their own history, their own path, their own culture. And so there are real problems with the rule of law, when it comes to actually respecting these rights. Whether it's police brutality, whether it's access to information, there is still very much a state which is trying to hold on to its powers and its prerogatives and resisting these demands for participation, transparency. But I think that the gain that can be, definitely said to be the case in Tunisia is that there is a space that has been created, a certain minimal level of freedom of expression in particular, limited civic and political rights, so the right to vote, the right to express yourself, the right to set up free media, which can be used as a medium to expand access to those other rights and to strengthen the rule of law. And that's the role of, I think, social movements, non-state actors can play, and civil society, which again is, I don't know if I'll have time to get to that, but I think the point is that in Tunisia, it's the transposition of these democratic institutions onto the existing state structures, which is where the problem lies, which is you have state structures which, particularly the bureaucracy and the administration, which has been used to exercising power in a certain way, and now is exposed to accountability and exposed to transparency and demands for participation. How do these institutions respond to these kinds of challenges? And I'm sure, there are many interesting things we could say about the experiences here in Central and Eastern Europe, about how institutions respond. What are the strategies that political actors have to reform these institutions? But I think Tunisia also faces a very difficult reality, which is its neighborhood. And I think neighborhood is quite important when it comes to democratization, that there is a loss of state capacity that happens at the moment of democratization that can be taken advantage of, particularly by your neighbors. And I think the situation that Tunisia finds itself in has very much influenced the political consensus, the type of political consensus within the country, which is trying to maintain a national and regional stability in a very unstable situation, and which to some extent prevents us from being able to really address the real conflicts within the structure of the state. So we have, I can go into more detail, but we have, and in the Arab region widely, you have a distributional state which has created very deep vested economic and political interests, including some of those same members of civil society are themselves part of the state, in fact, in many of these countries, have been co-opted by the state. And so how do you actually reform when political actors and economic actors who have power all agree on one thing, which is not to change? And so that's the real challenge. And I think just on civil society, I think that civil society, there are many definitions. I think what's interesting is how it can be a space for political learning, and how do you transform the social capital that develops into political capital, and questioning the link between participation and actual decision making. I think also is something that we have to address.
So I want to be brief, and actually I think I want to be practical with the risk of sounding a little bit naive. Right-wing populist movements do produce knowledge, but there is no good knowledge or bad knowledge. There is knowledge. The fact is that today there's a good and a bad. So knowledge production is not a reckless exercise of rediscussing everything from the beginning. Social movements have achieved great democratic changes. Civil rights movements, women movements, indigenous movement. We do know what is important, and there are things, like it was said before, that should not be negotiable anymore. So every sort of alternative knowledge production that questions human rights, for example, all the rights that she was mentioning, the right of vote, the right to participate, that is a legitimate exercise of producing knowledge. It's not going to become the practice. And I think that we are too often used to think a social movement as forces that change things, but sometimes we have to think about social movement as promoters of democracy because they save that piece of the status quo that should never be changed. And so conserving some actual forms of power is another task that it's not often, probably not often enough underlined. We have to use social movement as forces to guarantee human rights, which I think it's the top of the knowledge that we have ever produced. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Very quickly, first to Andrea's question on Facebook. Just to mention that the Spanish Indignados tried to develop some alternative digital social media to Facebook, which were not successful because they were not user-friendly. But in my research, I'm looking at other digital tools like Reddit, Agree, Agora, Voting, Lumio, which are facilitating and encouraging participation and deliberation. So we should distinguish between these social media and these other digital tools. To Philip's comment on limitation and the good and the bad guys, I was trying to underline the distance between the myth of digital democracy and the real use of these supposedly liberating technologies. And I want to believe that these grassroots technological activists are the good guys. They are trying to hack some authoritarian tendencies within political parties and institutions, and they are even trying to hack the very political parties which were designed to take the power, and they want to use to try to make real democracy work. So let's see what they are able to do. Finally, to your question on demobilization, we are seeing a well-known process with a long protest cycle with no results because the institutions didn't hear the voices in the streets. And now some activists are entering the institution in order to change them. Maybe the difference is that these technological activists, which I referred to, they are facilitating the participation of other people in the political process through the use of digital tools that in some way they are reproducing some important values and practices from the social movement. So this may be a difference, but I would leave it in that. Thank you.
Thank you. I take the last 2 minutes to maybe make a bridge between this panel and the next ones. I think from this point of view of social movements type of development, a need which is put forward is the need to contextualize this crisis of confidence, of trust, and there are different ways, probably not mutually exclusive. One conception which I think has been taken up also by Elena in these answers is Polanyi's conceptions of a crisis. We are in a moment in which movements are Polanyi's type of counter-movements in the sense of reacting to free market by putting again the accent on social protections. And as Polanyi had singled out about the first great transformations, these can take very different paths. It can take progressive path on the left, and it can take a regressive path on the right. It is the protection of the past, and it is a moment in which not only the prevailing movements are different in Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe and in other parts of the world, but also in all the countries there is these tensions, which is also tensions related with the Bella's questions about is the right also promoting conceptions of democracies, and to a certain extent there are some common points. What is about sovereignty, which is an element which unites or is common to both movements. What is the role of the people? What is the role of direct democracies? What is the role of a clean politics? This is one conception and one way of contextualizing the moment. It's a moment in which counter-movement react to the neoliberal development. But I think there is in social movement studies and in our debate also something different which connects also to protest in the working place. Wallerstein and other scholars of the so-called world system perspective stress the point that there are movements which developed as linked to the specific type of capitalist development. And I think that nowadays type of development, what David Harvey and others have described as a sort of new capitalism by dispossessions, is also at the basis of many of these protests. to reintroduce the social element in. But especially we are in a political moment that resemble the ones that Philippe has described in the past. So it is an eventful moment. It is a moment which is understructured, conjunctural, very agency-oriented. So a moment in which I think the different type of movements in the civil societies can be very relevant in introducing changes. But it is also a moment, it is nowadays very common to cite Gramsci's conceptions of a crisis, which is a moment in which the old is dying, but the new is not born yet, and it is a moment in which monster can be born, but it is also a moment in which we have to reason about these innovations. And with this, I thank you, my wonderful co-panelists, and the public, and see you in the afternoon.